I grew up in southern Indiana, and while I enjoyed my childhood there, I am aware that the history surrounding this part of America has its share of darkness. This is one story of a bright young woman whose life was tragically cut short by men who fueled the fires of hatred baked into the landscape of parts of America in the 1960s. This is Weird Wild Stories, and I typically discuss things that are strange, mysterious, and creepy. Today's story is one of darkness and hatred, but ultimately a little piece of closure was obtained. If you enjoy stories of true crime, mystery, and more, then go ahead and subscribe or follow me. Give me a like or leave me a comment. That really helps out a small channel like mine. Okay, with that being said, let's get into today's story. In 1968, Martinsville, Indiana was more than just a small town. It was a known sundown town, a place where black people were unwelcome after dark. For Carol Jenkins, a 20-year-old black woman, stepping into this hostile environment would prove to be a fatal decision. This is her story. Carol was born in 1947 to Elizabeth Jenkins in Franklin, Indiana. After her parents' divorce, her mother married Paul Davis, a local factory worker in nearby Rushville. Paul raised Carol as his own while he and Elizabeth went on to have 5 more children. Carol became the beloved big sister, someone the younger kids looked up to. Carol had dreams, big dreams. As a teenager, she wanted to move to Chicago and become a model. But life had other plans. In 1965, she graduated from Rushville High School and got a job at the Ford Motor Company's Philco plant. When a union strike shut down the plant, Carol looked for other work. That's when she took a job selling encyclopedias door-to-door for colliers. It was a way to make ends meet, but it would lead her into a nightmare. On September 16, 1968, Carol set out on her first day selling encyclopedias. Dressed in a white turtleneck, olive green pants, and a bright yellow scarf, she volunteered to go to Martinsville, a decision that would forever change her life. Martinsville was known to be a sundown town, but Carol believed she would be safe. After all, she was traveling with 3 co-workers, 2 white men, and a 19-year-old black woman. But as the day went on, Carol found herself alone, walking through the streets of a town where she wasn't welcome. For those unfamiliar, a sundown town was an all-too-common part of America's history. These towns, prevalent through much of the 20th century, had unspoken and sometimes very explicit rules. Black people could not be within city limits after sundown. Signs would even be posted at the town's borders, sending a clear and sinister message. The threat was very real. If you were black and caught in these towns after dark, you were in serious danger. As she made her rounds, a car began following her. Inside were 2 white men, who hurled racial slurs at her, catcalling and intimidating her. Fearing for her safety, Carol approached a nearby home and knocked on the door. It was the home of Don and Norma Neal, a young white couple. When Carol asked for help, saying, "Please let me in, I've got somebody following me," they didn't hesitate to let her in. The Neals called the police, and officers eventually found 2 men who admitted to following Carol, but nothing came of it. Norma, concerned for Carol, walked several blocks with her, searching for her co-workers. When they couldn't find them, Norma offered to let Carol stay with them for the night, but Carol, not wanting to cause any trouble, declined. She believed the worst was behind her and headed to the rendezvous point where she was supposed to meet her co-workers. But the danger hadn't passed. About 15 to 30 minutes later, the 2 men returned. This time, they weren't just following her. They were hunting her. One man grabbed Carol, holding her arms back, while the other stabbed her in the chest with a screwdriver. The men left her bleeding in the street where she died, alone and terrified. Carol's murder devastated her family. Her father, Paul Davis, was adamant that because Martinsville was a sundown town with a history of racism, the police weren't taking her case seriously. He even demanded that the FBI step in, but the local authorities refused. The case went cold, and for 33 long years, Carol's family was left with no answers. Then, in June 2000, a breakthrough. Carol's mother, Elizabeth, received an anonymous phone call. The caller revealed the name of the killer. Elizabeth immediately told Paul, who dipped into his retirement savings to hire a private investigator. Soon, the Indiana State Police took notice and assigned cold case investigators to look into Carol's murder once again. In November 2001, the investigators received another anonymous tip. this time in the form of a letter. The letter named Kenneth C. Richmond as Carol's killer. Richmond was a 70-year-old career criminal with ties to extremist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. At the time of the murder, he had been passing through Martinsville with another man after a day of drinking. But there was more. Richmond's daughter Shirley, who was just 7 years old at the time, had been in the car that night. Shirley, now estranged from her father for more than 2 decades, came forward and corroborated the story. She told investigators that she had watched from the back seat as her father and another man chased Carol down and killed her. Shirley even described the exact clothes Carol was wearing that night, details never released to the public. The brutal truth was that after murdering Carol, Kenneth Richmond had turned to his young daughter and, laughing, said, "She got what she deserved." He then handed Shirley $7, one for each year of her life, to buy her silence. Kenneth C. Richmond, the man identified as Carol Jenkins's murderer, was arrested in May 2002 while living in an Indianapolis nursing home. At the time of his arrest, Richmond was 70 years old and suffering from various health issues, including mental decline, possibly linked to dementia. Richmond never faced trial for Carol Jenkins' murder. He was declared incompetent to stand trial, and just 2 weeks later, on August 31, 2002, he passed away from bladder cancer. The identity of the second man involved in Carol Jenkins's murder has never been conclusively determined. While Kenneth C. Richmond was identified as the man who stabbed Carol, his daughter Shirley McQueen, who witnessed the murder as a 7-year-old, stated that Richmond was not acting alone. She told investigators that another man was with her father that night, but his identity remains unknown. Though Richmond never served time for Carol's murder, his identification and arrest provided some closure for Carol's family, after more than 30 years of waiting for justice. In the aftermath of Jenkins' tragic death, Dawn and Norma Neal, who had bravely tried to help her, found themselves the target of relentless harassment and even death threats. Their simple act of kindness placed them in the crosshairs of those who refused to let go of their hate. Years later, in 2014, the Neals sought to honor Carol's memory by proposing a monument in Martinsville. But their efforts were halted when County Commissioner Norman Voiles admitted he had to abandon the plans after receiving significant backlash from the community. Despite the obstacles, Carol's memory was not forgotten. On November 1, 2017, a community park in Rushville, Indiana, was rededicated in her honor, now known as Carol Jenkins Davis Park. The following day, a memory stone was placed in the garden of Martinsville's City Hall, serving as a quiet but powerful tribute to the young woman whose life was cut short. Carol Jenkins' murder stands as a haunting reminder of the violent racism that plagued, and still haunts, many American towns. Her story, tragically silenced for years, now serves as a call for justice and remembrance for those who face prejudice and hate. Though justice came late, the memory of Carol Jenkins endures.